The night air in Jerusalem still carried the weight of David's absence. The warrior king was gone, the shepherd who had slain giants, the fugitive who had hidden in caves, the ruler who had united tribes and carved out a kingdom from chaos had breathed his last. The songs that once echoed through the palace halls were quieter now. The throne he had occupied with fire and tears stood empty, and into that silence stepped his son. Solomon was young, not merely inexperienced, but young in a way that made the weight of a crown feel heavier than iron. He had not fought Goliath, he had not run from Saul, he had not endured decades of war. He inherited a kingdom already forged, its enemies subdued, its borders secured, its capital established. Yet inheritance is not the same as earning, and the peace he inherited carried its own pressure. The elders watched him, the generals measured him, the priests studied him, and somewhere beneath the golden ceremony, Solomon felt it, the quiet tremor of inadequacy. David had given him final instructions before he died. Be strong, walk in the ways of the Lord, keep his statutes, judge with righteousness. The words were not merely paternal advice, they were covenantal responsibility. The throne of Israel was not like other thrones. It did not stand by military strength alone, it stood by obedience. Solomon knew the stories, he had grown up inside them. He knew what happened when kings forgot the Lord. He knew how quickly favor could turn to discipline. The ark of God rested in Jerusalem now. The presence of the Holy One was near. That made leadership not safer, but more serious. So when his reign began, Solomon did something unexpected for a new king drunk on power. He went to Gibeon. There, at the high place, he offered sacrifices, thousands of burnt offerings rising into the night sky. The smoke ascended in thick spirals, carrying with it the unspoken prayers of a ruler standing at the edge of responsibility. The altar crackled, flames consumed what was laid upon it, and beneath the sound of fire and priests moving in the darkness, Solomon's heart wrestled. He did not yet know what kind of king he would become, but he knew what he lacked. That night, after the offerings, sleep came, and with it came something far greater than rest. The Lord appeared, not in thunder, not in battlefield spectacle, but in a dream, clear, undeniable, sovereign. The God of his father David spoke directly to him. The same voice that had guided shepherds and rebuked kings now addressed a young ruler at the beginning of his reign. Ask what I shall give you. There are moments in history when heaven leans close to earth. This was one of them. The question hung in the air with terrifying freedom. Ask Solomon could have asked for what kings typically crave: long life to secure legacy, riches to amplify influence, the death of enemies to eliminate threat. He could have asked for victory, dominion, expansion, monuments bearing his name. He paused. In that pause was the direction of his life. Solomon answered not as a conqueror, but as a child standing in his father's shadow. He acknowledged the covenant faithfulness shown to David. He recognized that it was God who had placed him on the throne. He confessed the magnitude of the people he was called to govern, a great people, too many to be numbered. And then he spoke the request that would define his identity for generations. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. An understanding heart, not merely intelligence, not strategy, not charisma, discernment, the ability to see beneath surface appearance, two-way motives, to judge rightly in matters where truth hides beneath emotion and conflict. He did not ask to be admired, he asked to judge justly. The request pleased the Lord, because Solomon's answer revealed something rare: awareness of dependence. God responded not only with what he asked, but with what he did not. Wisdom beyond measure, riches, honor, a promise of long life if he would walk in obedience. It was an overflow moment, heaven's generosity meeting humility. When Solomon awoke, the dream did not dissolve like ordinary night visions. It remained with him, solid, burning, real. He returned to Jerusalem. He stood before the Ark of the Covenant. He offered more sacrifices. He made a feast for his servants. But something had shifted. The crown no longer felt like a burden of uncertainty. It felt like a stewardship under divine commission. And then came the test. Not on a battlefield, not in a council chamber, but in a courtroom between two women. They stood before him, both claiming to be mothers of the same living child. Their story was tangled in grief. Two infants, one had died in the night, the other lived in the darkness. One mother had exchanged the bodies. Now only one child breathed. Both women claimed him as their own. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no clear proof. It was the kind of case that exposes the limits of human judgment. The room must have been silent as the women argued, voices rising, accusations flying, emotion raw and desperate. The living child, unaware of the weight placed upon him, likely cried in confusion. Solomon listened. This was the moment where a king proves whether his throne stands on appearance or substance. He ordered a sword to be brought. Shock must have rippled through the chamber. The metal gleamed under torchlight as it was placed before him. Divide the living child in two, Solomon said. Give half to one and half to the other. The words were cold, brutal, but they were not the end, because true wisdom understands the human heart. One woman spoke first, her voice breaking, pleading for the child's life. Give her the living child. Only do not kill him. The other remained hardened. If she could not have the child, neither would the other. And in that instant, Solomon saw what no evidence could reveal. Love exposes truth. Give the living child to the first woman. He commanded, "She is his mother." The chamber exhaled. The sword was lowered. The child was restored. Justice was not enforced by violence but revealed by insight. Word spread quickly through Israel. The people heard of the judgment the king had rendered, and they stood in awe not merely because of the cleverness of the decision, but because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Fear not terror, but reverent recognition settled over the nation. Their king was not merely David's son. He was a man endowed with discernment from heaven. In those early years, Solomon's reign shone with promise. The kingdom flourished. Peace extended across borders. Neighboring rulers respected him. Trade routes prospered. The treasury filled. People dwelled safely, each under his vine and fig tree. It felt like fulfillment. The promise given to Abraham to become a great nation seemed tangible in streets bustling with stability. The covenant with David to establish his throne appeared secure. Solomon was not conquering through war. He was establishing through wisdom. Wisdom in those days was not abstraction. It was visible in policies, in administration, in diplomacy, in order. The young king who once trembled before responsibility now walked with quiet authority. He organized officials, structured labor forces, expanded infrastructure. His understanding reached into governance itself. But beneath all the achievement was a deeper truth. Wisdom is a gift, and gifts must be guarded. In the beginning, Solomon's heart was aligned with his request. He knew he was insufficient without divine guidance. He had tasted dependence. He had experienced the pleasure of God in humility. The danger of success had not yet revealed itself. For now, the light was golden. For now, the throne was steady. For now, the prayers offered at Gibeon still echoed in the chambers of memory. There is something profoundly beautiful about the beginning of a life surrendered to wisdom. The humility of youth meeting the generosity of God. The willingness to ask not for dominance, but for discernment. It is the kind of beginning that stirs hope in those watching. Solomon's story at this stage reads like promise fulfilled. A king who could have asked for anything, choosing instead the ability to judge rightly. A ruler who understood that governing people required more than strength. A leader who recognized that moral clarity mattered more than military expansion. Yet even in the brilliance of early faithfulness, seeds lie dormant. Every gift contains a test. Wisdom can lead to reverence or to pride. Understanding can deepen dependence or create illusion of self-sufficiency. The same God who appeared in a dream had attached a condition. If you walk in my ways, obedience remains the quiet hinge on which destiny turns. As the years unfolded, Solomon would write proverbs about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom. He would speak of guarding the heart, of avoiding the path that seems right but leads to death. He would articulate truths so piercing they would echo for centuries. But on that first night when the altar smoke rose, when heaven offered open-ended generosity, when a young king admitted his need, the trajectory of his life was set not by brilliance, but by humility. That was his greatest strength. And, as history would later reveal, the standard by which his later choices would be measured. The throne gleamed, the kingdom prospered, the people rested in awe, and the young king who asked for wisdom stood at the beginning of a reign that would be remembered for unmatched glory and eventual fracture. But in this moment, before temples were built and alliances forged, before gold accumulated in staggering measure, before foreign influences whispered compromise, there was only a young ruler, a divine question, and a humble request that pleased the heart of God. Give your servant an understanding heart. It was enough. For a time, the wisdom that had astonished Israel did not remain confined to a single courtroom decision. It began to shape the entire architecture of Solomon's reign. What started as discernment between two grieving women slowly unfolded into a kingdom ordered with precision, efficiency, and vision. The young king who once trembled at the weight of responsibility began to move with deliberate confidence. Wisdom was no longer simply a gift proven in crisis. It became the foundation upon which he built an empire. The administration of Israel transformed under his hand. Officials were appointed with clarity of function. District governors ensured steady provision for the royal household. Supply lines were calculated with foresight rather than desperation. In David's reign, strength had been measured by the sword. Under Solomon, strength was measured by stability. The land knew peace. Borders once defended by bloodshed became lines of trade and diplomacy. Nations that once feared Israel's armies now sought Israel's counsel. Solomon's wisdom was not only judicial, it was organizational. He understood that order preserves peace more effectively than force. He structured labor forces, coordinated projects, and distributed responsibility across the kingdom. The machinery of governance moved like a living organism, every part contributing to the health of the whole. Prosperity followed not as accident, but as consequence. And prosperity is a powerful amplifier. Silver became so abundant in Jerusalem that it was considered of little account. Cedar from Lebanon flowed into the city. Horses were imported. Trade routes stretched toward distant lands. Merchant caravans carried spices and rare goods into the royal courts. Wealth accumulated with astonishing speed. Gold did not merely decorate the palace, it defined it. The kingdom of Solomon shone with a brilliance Israel had never known. But alongside wealth grew something less visible: reputation. Word spread beyond Israel's borders. The king who had divided a child with a sentence, who governed without chaos, who prospered without constant war. This king became a subject of fascination. His proverbs began to circulate. His sayings were repeated in foreign courts. Wisdom, like gold, attracted attention. The atmosphere of Jerusalem changed. It was no longer merely a capital of covenant promise. It became a center of intellectual gravity. Men traveled not to challenge him, but to hear him. The throne of David became a seat of discourse. Questions about life, justice, power, and meaning were brought before Solomon. And he answered. He spoke of tress from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop growing from the wall. He spoke of animals, birds, creeping things, and fish. His understanding reached into the natural world as though he perceived patterns woven by the Creator's own hand. Knowledge flowed from him effortlessly. It was not the knowledge of conquest, but of comprehension. People listened, and listening they admired. Admiration is subtler than opposition. It warms the heart without alarming it. It confirms identity in ways that feel deserved. Solomon remained outwardly devoted to the Lord in those years. Sacrifices were offered. Worship was maintained. The covenant was honored in public expression. Yet prosperity has a way of testing devotion more quietly than suffering does. In hardship, one clings to God for survival. In abundance, one risks assuming survival is secured. The palace expanded. The royal court grew more intricate. Servants multiplied. The scale of daily life increased beyond what David had ever known. Solomon did not merely inherit a throne, he elevated it. He envisioned something larger than stability. He envisioned magnificence. That vision began to crystallize into a singular ambition, the building of the temple. David had long desired to construct a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, but he had been told that the task would belong to his son. Solomon inherited not only the throne but also that sacred commission. The thought must have both honored and intimidated him. To build a house for the Lord was no ordinary architectural project. It was a theological statement carved into stone. Preparations began with extraordinary scale. Agreements were formed with Hiram, king of Tyre. Cedar and cypress were cut from Lebanon's forests. Skilled craftsmen were commissioned. Bronze, gold, and precious materials were gathered in staggering quantities. Laborers were organized into rotating shifts, thousands upon thousands working to bring the vision into reality. The temple would not merely be functional. It would be breathtaking. 7 years passed in construction. Stone was shaped off-site so that no sound of hammer or chisel would disturb the sanctity of the building grounds. Precision marked every measurement. Gold overlaid interior walls. Carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers adorned the surfaces. The inner sanctuary, the most holy place, was prepared to house the ark, the symbol of divine presence. When the day of dedication arrived, Jerusalem filled with anticipation. The ark was brought from the city of David into the temple. Priests carried it reverently. The atmosphere thickened with solemnity. Sacrifices were offered beyond number. And then, as the priests withdrew from the sanctuary, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. It was the same kind of cloud that had led Israel through the wilderness, the same kind of glory that had descended upon Sinai. The presence of God manifested not as abstraction but as overwhelming reality. The priests could not stand to minister because of the glory. Solomon stood before the altar, hands raised toward heaven. He spoke not as administrator nor philosopher, nor monarch drunk on success. He prayed. He acknowledged that heaven and the highest heavens could not contain God, much less the house he had built. He pleaded that the Lord's eyes and ears would be attentive to prayers offered in that place. He interceded for future generations, for forgiveness, for restoration, for mercy when the people sinned and turned back. It was a moment of humility wrapped in grandeur. Fire fell from heaven and consumed the offerings. The glory filled the temple again. The people bowed with faces to the ground, declaring, "For he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." In that scene, everything aligned. Wisdom, wealth, obedience, glory. The promises given to David seemed fully realized. Israel stood at the pinnacle of its unity. The temple stood as visible testimony that God's covenant endured. Solomon's reign appeared unshakable, but alignment can breed subtle confidence. The temple was completed. The palace complex followed, larger, even more elaborate. It took 13 years to finish Solomon's own house, nearly twice the time required for the Lord's house. The scale of personal construction exceeded the sacred project, though no explicit rebellion marked this shift. The contrast carried quiet symbolism. Solomon's court grew increasingly international. Alliances formed through diplomacy and marriage. The king who once confessed youth and inadequacy now negotiated with seasoned rulers. He learned the language of empire strategy without battle, influence without bloodshed. Peace was preserved not merely by covenant loyalty, but by political arrangement. Wisdom enabled him to navigate these complexities. It also enabled him to rationalize them. Trade flourished on unprecedented levels. Fleets sailed to distant lands, returning with exotic goods. Gold accumulated in such abundance that shields of hammered gold decorated the palace. The throne itself was overlaid with ivory and gold, flanked by carved lions. No throne like it had ever been made. Visitors entered Jerusalem and stood astonished. The order of his servants, the seating of officials, the attire of attendants all testified to meticulous control. Even the ascent by which Solomon went up to the house of the Lord was crafted with splendor. The Queen of Sheba eventually arrived, drawn by reports too extraordinary to ignore. She came with riddles, hard questions, treasures. When she saw the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food of his table, the organization of his servants, her breath was taken away. She confessed that not even half of what she had heard was told her. "Blessed be the Lord your God," she said, "who delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel." It was international affirmation, confirmation that his wisdom was no localized phenomenon. Solomon had become more than Israel's king. He was a global figure. And yet, within admiration lies vulnerability, because wisdom that astonishes others can slowly convince its bearer that he sees clearly in all things. The gift given in humility can evolve into an identity claimed in confidence. Solomon's heart had once trembled under responsibility. Now it moved among gold, diplomacy, and universal praise. His understanding remained sharp. His administration remained effective. His external devotion remained visible. But the human heart rarely shifts through dramatic rupture. It drifts through subtle accommodation. The Lord had appeared to him at Gibeon. Later, after the temple dedication, the Lord appeared again, reaffirming covenant promises if he would walk faithfully as David had. The condition remained unchanged. If prosperity does not cancel covenant requirement, but prosperity can soften vigilance. In those years of expansion, nothing seemed amiss. The kingdom stood united. The temple stood radiant. The people prospered. Songs of thanksgiving filled the courts. Pilgrims ascended to Jerusalem with joy. Yet seeds of compromise often root during seasons of triumph. Solomon's wisdom continued to produce proverbs. He wrote songs, many of them. His intellect spanned subjects vast and varied. He explored the depths of human experience, the pursuit of pleasure, the accumulation of knowledge, the inevitability of death. Questions formed within him not because he lacked faith, but because he possessed capacity for inquiry. An inquiry, while powerful, can lead in two directions: deeper reverence or restless experimentation. At this point in his reign, the line had not yet been crossed. The fracture had not yet appeared, but trajectory matters. The systems he built, the alliances he formed, the wealth he accumulated all increased the complexity of his world. And complexity often demands compromise to sustain itself. The young king who once stood before God with empty hands now stood surrounded by fullness. The question was no longer what he lacked, but what he might desire beyond sufficiency. Wisdom had brought him to the summit of success. The summit is beautiful, the summit is dangerous. Because when there are no visible enemies, one forgets to guard the heart. Solomon had asked for discernment between good and evil. God had granted it abundantly. But discernment must be exercised continuously. It is not self-sustaining. It depends upon alignment with the giver. For now, Israel rested in golden light. The temple gleamed against Jerusalem's skyline. The king's name was spoken with admiration from distant lands. The covenant stood intact. The promises seemed secure, but history does not measure a reign only by its rise. It measures whether the wisdom that built a kingdom can guard the heart that wears the crown. Gold has a sound when it moves in large quantities. It does not clang like iron or ring like bronze. It hums with weight. In the days of Solomon's rising glory, that hum became the background music of Jerusalem. Caravans entered the city gates bearing tribute. Ships returned from distant waters heavy with cargo. Markets swelled, storehouses filled. The kingdom that once fought for survival now managed abundance beyond imagination. It began subtly, as prosperity often does. Trade agreements with neighboring nations strengthened political peace. Horses and chariots multiplied, imported from Egypt and other lands. Cedar from Lebanon became common in royal projects. The palace complex expanded in scale and sophistication. What David had established through conquest, Solomon now refined through administration and commerce. And commerce became a river. Year by year, gold flowed into Israel 666 talents annually. Not counting what merchants and governors brought through trade. The number itself would later carry symbolic weight, but in that moment it represented prosperity on a scale unseen in Israel's history. Silver lost its rarity. It lay in Jerusalem like stones. Ivory and exotic animals appeared in the royal menagerie. Monkeys, peacocks, rare woods, spices, luxuries once imagined now displayed. The throne of Solomon was constructed with layers of opulence. Ivory overlaid with pure gold, 6 steps ascending toward it, 12 lions standing guard along the steps. It was not merely a seat of governance, it was spectacle. No other kingdom possessed such artistry. Visitors did not simply see power, they felt it embodied in craftsmanship. Yet splendor alters atmosphere. The king who once stood in Gibeon asking for discernment now presided over a court accustomed to magnificence. Ceremony grew intricate. Attendants lined corridors. Officials dressed in garments reflecting order and status. The ascent to the house of the Lord was adorned with careful beauty. Nothing was left unimproved. Improvement, however, is not neutral. It reshapes expectation. When the temple had been dedicated, Solomon's prayer acknowledged that heaven could not be contained within stone walls. He had understood transcendence. He had bowed in humility. Fire from heaven had confirmed divine pleasure. The glory cloud had filled the sanctuary. But years passed. The temple became familiar. The extraordinary became routine. Sacrifices continued. Festivals remained observed. Pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem. Outward devotion persisted, yet the human heart adapts quickly to wonder. What once stirred awe can become background. Solomon's wisdom extended not only into governance and poetry but into architecture and design. He built not only the temple and his palace but also cities, storehouses, and fortifications. Asor, Mahida Hiser. Strategic centers strengthened under his vision. Infrastructure expanded across the land. Labor forces were organized with mathematical precision. Israel transformed from tribal confederation into structured state. But organization requires manpower. Solomon conscripted labor from among the people. Rotational systems were implemented. Tens of thousands were sent to cut timber. Others quarried stone, and others served in administrative roles. The system functioned efficiently but at cost. David's wars had required sacrifice. Solomon's projects demanded sustained labor. The people did not yet rebel. The kingdom still enjoyed peace. Prosperity softened complaint. But the weight of royal ambition pressed quietly upon the populace. Solomon justified expansion through vision. A strong kingdom required infrastructure. A respected throne demanded visible strength. International diplomacy required matching splendor. Alliances were maintained through exchange goods, influence, family, and family became political. Marriage was no longer merely companionship. It became treaty. Daughters of foreign kings entered Jerusalem. Each union strengthened alliances, secured borders, guaranteed trade routes. Egypt's princess came into the city. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women followed. At first, these marriages appeared strategic. A peaceful empire rests on balanced relationships. Yet the law given to Israel had warned against multiplying wives, especially from nations that served other gods. The warning was not rooted in xenophobia but in spiritual realism. Hearts are influenced by affection. Worship can be diluted by familiarity. Solomon understood the law. He had written proverbs about avoiding the strange woman, about guarding the heart. He knew the danger of divided loyalty, but understanding does not always prevent accommodation. At first, the presence of foreign wives likely felt manageable. Their customs remained peripheral, their worship private. The temple in Jerusalem stood dominant. The covenant remained public. Yet affection creates space. Altars erected for political convenience did not initially replace the altar of the Lord. They coexisted. Coexistence can seem harmless when identity feels secure. Solomon's wisdom allowed him to rationalize complexity. He could perceive nuance. He understood international politics. He believed himself capable of navigating competing loyalties without surrendering conviction. His heart, after all, had once asked for discernment between good and evil. Discernment can identify danger, but it cannot substitute for obedience. The accumulation of wives increased. 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, numbers that stagger imagination. The palace became not merely administrative center but mosaic of cultures. Languages mingled in corridors, traditions interwove, influence multiplied. Each woman brought memory of homeland, reverence for ancestral gods, nostalgia for native ritual. And slowly, so gradually it would have seemed negligible, Solomon's heart tilted. It did not collapse in one dramatic betrayal. It leaned. In the early years, his love for the Lord defined him. Now, his love was distributed across alliances. The king who once declared dependence began to accommodate plurality. High places appeared. Altars for Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, for Chemosh of Moab, for Molech of the Ammonites. The very hills surrounding Jerusalem bore witness to divided devotion. What had been reserved for the God who filled the temple now expanded to house lesser deities. Solomon did not cease worshipping the Lord entirely. That is what makes the shift so tragic. He added, addition diluted exclusivity. The covenant had demanded singular allegiance. You shall have no other gods before me. Not above, not alongside, not in partnership. But Solomon's empire required tolerance. Intolerance became compromise. The temple still stood. Sacrifices were still offered. Priests still ministered. The glory of past years remained a memory etched into stone. Yet the king's private accommodations undermined public covenant. Wisdom did not depart him intellectually. His writings still reflected insight. His governance remained effective. The kingdom continued to prosper materially. But spiritual erosion rarely announces itself through economic decline. It reveals itself in heart posture. Solomon's heart, once undivided, now served multiple affections. He had built a house for the Lord unparalleled in beauty. Now he built shrines for foreign gods. The contrast did not escape heaven's notice. The Lord, who had appeared to him twice, watched. The same voice that once asked, "Ask what I shall give you," now observed the trajectory of the answer. Wisdom had been granted abundantly. Riches had been added. Honor had surpassed other kings. The conditional promise, "If you walk in my ways," still lingered over his reign. Prosperity blinded many to warning signs. Peace continued externally. Trade routes remained active. Jerusalem glittered beneath the sun. Visitors marveled at organization and order. The Queen of Sheba's amazement was still recounted with pride, but beneath gold lay fracture. Solomon began exploring experiences beyond covenant boundaries. Ecclesiastes would later record his reflections on pleasure, laughter, wine, projects, gardens, wealth, singers, concubines, every delight the heart might pursue. He withheld nothing from himself. Experimentation replaced restraint. He searched for meaning not only in obedience but in indulgence. An indulgence, though temporarily satisfying, leaves residue. The heart that once trembled in humility at Gibeon grew accustomed to self-direction. He had mastered governance, diplomacy, architecture, and discourse. Why not mastery of pleasure? Why not test the boundaries of experience and still maintain wisdom? Because wisdom divorced from obedience becomes self-trust. Self-trust, when elevated above covenant trust, leads imperceptibly toward fracture. The people did not immediately see decline. Outward success masked inward drift. But God measures kingdoms differently than nations do. He measures loyalty. He measures the unseen inclination of the heart. Solomon had asked for the ability to discern good from evil. He possessed that discernment still, yet possessing discernment does not guarantee choosing rightly. Each alliance signed, each altar permitted, each compromise justified as political necessity formed threads in a tapestry of quiet rebellion. It was not rebellion born of hatred for God. It was rebellion born of divided affection. The most dangerous deviation is not open rejection. It is partial devotion. Israel's covenant had always been clear. They were a people set apart. Their identity depended on exclusivity of worship. Kings were to embody that loyalty. Solomon embodied something more complex, brilliant, cultured, globally respected, and spiritually diluted. The hills surrounding Jerusalem became symbols. On one hill, the temple glowed with gold. On others, smoke rose from altars to gods who could not speak. The same city housed glory and compromise. And heaven's patience approached its threshold, because the promise given to David that his throne would be established was intertwined with obedience. The covenant with Solomon had included warning. If he or his sons turned aside to serve other gods, the kingdom would be cut off. The house built for the Lord would become a proverb and byword among the nations. Words once spoken in blessing now hovered as warning. Solomon's wisdom had built structures magnificent beyond comparison. But wisdom misaligned with obedience begins dismantling what it built. The hum of gold continued in Jerusalem. But beneath it, another sound began, quiet, distant, almost imperceptible. The sound of division forming. Not yet visible, not yet erupting, but inevitable. When the Lord had appeared to Solomon the second time, it was not in a moment of uncertainty, but in the aftermath of triumph. The temple stood completed. Fire had fallen from heaven. The glory had filled the sanctuary. The people had bowed with faces to the ground. It was the kind of spiritual climax that feels unshakable, as though nothing could fracture what God himself had affirmed. And yet it was after that height that the warning came. I have heard your prayer, the Lord said. I have consecrated this house that you have built. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. If. The word did not cancel the promise, but it defined its condition. Solomon heard it. He understood covenant language. Blessing was never detached from obedience. The throne of Israel was not sustained by architecture or gold or diplomacy, but by faithfulness. The temple itself, though filled with glory, would not protect the kingdom if the king's heart turned aside. At that moment, nothing outward suggested danger. The kingdom was secure, enemies were subdued, trade flourished. The people prospered. The Lord's presence had manifested unmistakably. If there was ever a time to feel confident in permanence, this was it. But warning rarely accompanies visible collapse. It comes when drift begins quietly. Solomon's reign entered its mature years wrapped in brilliance. The palace complex was complete, larger and more elaborate than any structure Israel had known. The house of the forest of Lebanon, supported by rows of cedar pillars, stood as architectural testimony to grandeur. Shields of gold lined its walls. Ceremonial order defined daily life. The king's administrative machine functioned flawlessly. Governors supplied provisions month by month. Military forces were organized, chariot cities expanded, international trade routes pulsed with activity. The name of Solomon carried weight in distant lands. Yet peace can conceal brewing storms. The first tremor came not from within Jerusalem, but from beyond its borders. Hadad the Edomite rose as an adversary. Rezon of Damascus gathered strength. These were not overwhelming threats at first. They were reminders, subtle signals that security was not self-sustaining. The Lord was stirring opposition, not yet full judgment, not yet open fracture, but pressure. Solomon's response was not panic. His kingdom was strong enough to manage regional unrest. His alliances remained intact. His resources were vast. He could address resistance through diplomacy or force. Yet the appearance of adversaries signaled something deeper than geopolitical tension. It signaled divine displeasure beginning to move. Because Solomon's heart had continued its slow tilt. His foreign wives, once political strategy, had become personal attachment. Affection deepened influence. What began as accommodation grew into participation. He did not merely permit their worship, he facilitated it. High places were constructed on the hills east of Jerusalem. Altars rose for Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Molech, names once distant now woven into the landscape of the chosen city. Jerusalem, city of covenant, now bore symbols of divided devotion. It is difficult to imagine the internal reasoning of Solomon during this time. He was not ignorant. He knew the law. He knew the first commandment. He had written Proverbs declaring that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He had spoken about guarding the heart, about paths that seem right but lead to death. Perhaps he believed his wisdom insulated him. Perhaps he thought participation would remain ceremonial, not transformative. Perhaps he convinced himself that political unity required religious tolerance. Wisdom can construct arguments for compromise as easily as it discerns truth, but covenant is not negotiated. The Lord grew angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away. Twice God had appeared to him. Twice covenant had been reaffirmed. The privilege granted to Solomon exceeded that of most kings. Revelation increases responsibility. And so the word of judgment came. Since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. The sentence was devastating. Yet even judgment carried mercy. For the sake of David, the kingdom would not be torn away during Solomon's lifetime. A remnant one tribe would remain under his son. The promise to David would not be entirely nullified, but unity would fracture. Imagine the weight of that pronouncement. Solomon, who had built in stone and gold, now faced dismantling decreed by heaven, not invasion, not economic collapse, division from within. The irony cut deep. The king who once asked for discernment between good and evil had allowed his own heart to blur the boundary. The ruler who had unified Israel under unmatched prosperity would leave it divided. The adversary strengthened. Jeroboam, one of Solomon's own officials, emerged as another instrument of unfolding judgment, a capable administrator over forced labor. Jeroboam was industrious and ambitious. The prophet Ahijah met him on the road, tore a new garment into 12 pieces, and gave him 10, symbolizing the 10 tribes that would be taken from Solomon's house. The message was clear. Division was not rumor. It was decree. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, waiting. Solomon likely heard reports of prophecy and unrest. Perhaps he felt the ground shifting beneath the polished floors of his palace. But outwardly, the kingdom continued functioning. Projects remained underway. Administration did not cease. Gold still flowed, yet something had changed. The security he once felt was now shadowed by inevitability. It is possible that during these later years Solomon began composing reflections that would later be preserved in Ecclesiastes, words shaped by experience rather than theory, observations not from assent, but from awareness of limits. Vanity of vanities, he would write. All is vanity. The word carries meaning of vapor, breath, mist, something visible yet fleeting. For a man who had accumulated more tangible substance than any king before him, the realization must have cut sharply. Wealth did not anchor permanence. Wisdom did not guarantee obedience. Pleasure did not satisfy longing. Achievement did not silence mortality. He had built gardens, planted vineyards, amassed treasures, surrounded himself with singers and delights. He withheld nothing his eyes desired, and yet perhaps the warning of torn kingdom pressed him toward introspection. Perhaps he saw the seeds he had planted through compromise. Perhaps he recognized too late that divided loyalty yields divided legacy. The temple still stood, the sacrifices still rose, but the unity of heart required for covenant blessing had fractured. Solomon's later reign carried an undertone absent in his youth. The golden brilliance remained, but it felt heavy. The palace corridors echoed differently. The knowledge of coming division lingered like distant thunder. He could not undo what had been decreed. The Lord had delayed judgment for David's sake, not Solomon's merit. That realization humbles even kings. As years passed, the once young ruler aged, his hair likely silvered, his stride slowed. The memory of Gibeon's dream must have visited him, God's voice offering unlimited requests. The humility of that night contrasted painfully with the complexity of his present reality. He had asked for an understanding heart. He had received it. But understanding without steadfast obedience cannot preserve what it builds. The adversaries did not conquer Jerusalem in his lifetime. The kingdom did not visibly collapse while he breathed. Yet beneath the surface, fissures widened. Loyalty to the house of David weakened among northern tribes. Labor burdens fostered resentment. The magnificence that impressed foreign queens weighed heavily on local shoulders. Solomon's story, at this stage, becomes quieter not because events ceased, but because inevitability settled in. There is a particular silence that accompanies approaching consequence. It is not the silence of ignorance but of awareness without remedy. When he finally died, he was buried in the city of David, his father. Rehoboam, his son, ascended the throne. The gold remained, the temple remained, the administrative systems remained, but the heart of the kingdom was fragile. And when Rehoboam chose harshness over wisdom, the fracture long foretold erupted. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam. The united monarchy split into north and south. Israel and Judah became separate realms. The tearing had occurred. Solomon's reign would forever be remembered as the golden age, the peak of Israel's political and economic strength. Yet it would also be remembered as the beginning of division. The paradox defines him. He was the wisest of kings, and he failed to guard his own heart. He built the most magnificent house for the Lord, and permitted altars to foreign gods. He unified a nation, and left it fractured. His life stands as testimony that brilliance cannot replace obedience, that prosperity cannot secure covenant, that wisdom must remain anchored in reverence. In the early days, Solomon feared inadequacy and sought divine help. In later days, abundance softened vigilance. The shift was not explosive, it was gradual, and that is what makes it so instructive. The story does not end with open rebellion against God, but with divided affection. And divided affection is enough to unravel legacy. Gold fades, structures crumble, kingdoms split. But the warning spoken after the temple's dedication still echoes beyond Solomon's lifetime. If you walk before me, the condition remains timeless. Wisdom is a gift, obedience is a choice. And the distance between glory and fracture is often measured not in public acts, but in the quiet inclinations of the heart. Age does something to a man that youth never can. It slows the body, but it sharpens memory. When strength fades, reflection grows louder. For Solomon, the later years of his life were not marked by military collapse or public disgrace. The kingdom still stood. The temples still gleamed. Gold still adorned Jerusalem. Yet inside the king, something far more significant was shifting. The noise of construction had ceased. The thrill of expansion had settled into maintenance. Diplomacy no longer felt like conquest. Pleasure no longer carried surprise. What once dazzled him had become predictable. And when predictability overtakes delight, the soul begins asking different questions. Solomon had tasted everything available to a king. He had not restrained himself from achievement. He had explored learning in its bred proverbs, songs, observation of nature, governance, philosophy. He had explored wealth without limitation. He had explored pleasure without denial. Gardens, vineyards, pools of water, singers, treasures, companionship. His life had become an experiment in abundance. But abundance had not answered the deeper hunger. The realization likely did not arrive all at once. It seeped in gradually, like dusk overtaking daylight. The laughter that once felt vibrant began to sound hollow. The satisfaction of completed projects faded quicker than before. The admiration of foreign rulers echoed without warmth. He began to see repetition. Generations rise and pass away. The sun rises and sets. The wind blows south and turns north. Streams run to the sea, yet the sea is never full. The rhythm of the world continues indifferent to individual accomplishment. For a man who had built monuments, this observation must have been unsettling. Structures endure for a time, but even stone weathers. Names are spoken for a generation, then replaced by another. Memory itself is fragile. Solomon's reflections moved toward language that would later be preserved as Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities. He wrote, "All is vanity." The Hebrew word carries the sense of vapor, something visible yet intangible, present yet slipping through fingers. He was not denying the reality of what he built. He was recognizing its inability to anchor meaning. The temple stood as a masterpiece, yet he knew that even sacred structures could become empty if hearts drifted. He had seen his own heart tilt. He had felt the subtle erosion of singular devotion. He understood that knowledge alone does not produce faithfulness. Wisdom had given him insight into the patterns of life, but insight without obedience had led him into compromise. Now, in aging reflection, he traced the arc backward. He saw the night at Gibeon when humility defined him. He saw the courtroom with two mothers, when discernment revealed truth. He saw the dedication of the temple, when fire fell from heaven. And he saw the altars on the hills east of Jerusalem, when affection fractured allegiance. The contrast was stark. What once pleased the Lord had turned into what provoked him. And though the kingdom would not be torn during his lifetime, the knowledge of its coming division must have weighed heavily. He knew his son would inherit not only wealth but instability. He knew that his choices had consequences beyond his own years. There is a particular grief in recognizing that wisdom does not exempt one from regret. Solomon's later writings suggest a man wrestling with limits. He examined work and found it fleeting. He examined pleasure and found it insufficient. He examined wealth and found it unable to satisfy the soul. He examined knowledge and discovered that increased wisdom brings increased sorrow. To see clearly is to perceive injustice, brevity, unpredictability. He observed that the righteous sometimes suffer while the wicked prosper. That time and chance happen to all. That death comes for the wise and the fool alike. The inevitability of mortality leveled the hierarchy he had constructed. Kings and servants returned to dust. For a monarch accustomed to control, the inability to master death must have been humbling. Perhaps that humility resembled, faintly, the humility of his youth. But it came now tempered by experience and consequence. He began to understand that life under the sun, life measured purely by human striving, cannot produce ultimate meaning. Projects end, empires divide, bodies age, applause fades. He had lived at the summit of possibility. If anyone could extract lasting fulfillment from wealth, it was Solomon. If anyone could secure legacy through architecture, it was Solomon. If anyone could satisfy curiosity through knowledge, it was Solomon. And yet his conclusion did not celebrate achievement. It questioned it. This was not the despair of ignorance. It was the sober realism of someone who had exhausted the experiment. He saw oppression in society and recognized that power often protects the powerful. He saw toil driven by envy. He saw loneliness among the successful. He saw the fragility of joy. But his reflections did not settle into nihilism. They circled back to something foundational. "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth," he would write. "Before the silver cord is snapped, before the golden bowl is broken, before the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." These were not abstract religious slogans. They were confessions shaped by lived experience. He knew what it meant to forget the exclusivity of devotion. He knew what it meant to divide affection. He knew how subtle compromise appears harmless until its fruit ripens into fracture. The golden years of Israel had been brilliant externally, but brilliance without reverence corrodes internally. Solomon's tone shifted from celebration to caution. He urged enjoyment of simple gifts for a drink, companionship not as ultimate meaning, but as gracious portions within a fleeting life. He recognized that control is limited, that outcomes often lie beyond human planning. He saw that striving to grasp permanence through achievement is like chasing wind. Chasing wind. The metaphor captures his realization perfectly. The more forcefully one pursues it, the more elusive it becomes, perhaps in quiet moments within the palace. Solomon walked through halls once filled with foreign voices and reflected on the cost of divided loyalty. Perhaps he passed by windows overlooking the temple and felt both gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for what God had allowed him to build. Sorrow for how he had allowed his heart to wander. Scripture does not record a dramatic public repentance. There is no scene of Solomon tearing down the high places with his own hands. The narrative remains restrained, almost sobering in its brevity. But Ecclesiastes reads like a man who has come to clarity, not the fiery clarity of youth, the tempered clarity of age. His final words in that book gather his observations into one conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. After experiments with pleasure, after exploration of knowledge, after accumulation of wealth, after recognition of mortality, he returned to simplicity. Fear God, keep his commandments, the very foundation he had once embodied at Gibeon. The circle had closed, yet the consequences of his drift would not vanish with insight. The kingdom would divide. The unity of Israel would fracture. Future generations would struggle under kings who inherited both a temple and attention. Solomon's legacy became paradox. He was remembered as the wisest man who ever lived. He was remembered as the builder of the temple. He was remembered as the king whose heart turned, and perhaps most poignantly, he was remembered as the voice who declared the vanity of chasing everything except God. There is something profoundly human in his story. It does not read like myth detached from reality. It reads like the arc of many lives, beginning with humility, rising into success, drifting through compromise, awakening into reflection. The difference is scale. Solomon's stage was national, his resources unmatched, his influence vast, but the internal dynamics are universal. Wisdom must remain tethered to reverence. Prosperity must not replace dependence. Affection must not divide allegiance. In his youth, he asked for an understanding heart. In his old age, he seemed to realize that understanding without steadfast obedience is incomplete. The palace would one day quiet permanently. The throne would be occupied by another. The gold would tarnish. The temple would eventually fall centuries later. But the words he penned in reflection would endure far longer than his monuments. Fear God and keep his commandments. It is not a grand architectural vision. It is not a diplomatic strategy. It is not an economic formula. It is the distilled wisdom of a king who had seen the heights of glory and the beginnings of fracture, and who learned it perhaps painfully that the heart must remain undivided if the kingdom is to endure. When Solomon's life drew to its quiet close, there was no battlefield surrounding his final breath, no invading army crashing against Jerusalem's walls. The kingdom still shimmered. The temple still stood radiant with gold. The administrative systems functioned to outward appearance. The empire he had built remained intact, yet beneath the surface, tension coiled like a spring compressed too long. Death has a way of revealing what prosperity can conceal. Solomon was buried in the city of David his father. The chronicles of his reign would later summarize his years with measured dignity: 40 years on the throne. A reign unmatched in wealth and renown. But history does not pause at burial. It moves immediately to consequence. Rehoboam, his son, ascended the throne. The inheritance he received was dazzling and dangerous. He inherited the temple in all its magnificence. He inherited treasuries heavy with gold. He inherited fortified cities and established trade routes. He inherited international recognition. And he inherited a people burdened by years of royal expansion. The forced labor, once masked by prosperity, had not been forgotten. The scale of construction projects that glorified Solomon had pressed upon ordinary families. Taxes and levies sustained grandeur. During Solomon's lifetime, his personal authority and reputation had suppressed rebellion. But reverence for the father does not automatically transfer to the son. The tribes gathered at Shechem to confirm Rehoboam as king. Jeroboam returned from Egypt, where he had fled years earlier after the prophet Ahijah foretold division. Now he stood not merely as administrator, but as voice for northern discontent. Their request was simple: lighten the heavy yoke your father placed upon us, and we will serve you. It was a defining moment. Solomon, in his youth, had faced a defining moment when offered anything he desired. He had chosen wisdom. Rehoboam now faced his own crossroads, not about wealth or power, but about humility. He asked for counsel. The elders who had served Solomon advised him wisely. Speak kindly to the people, serve them, answer gently, and they will be your servants forever. It was counsel shaped by experience. Authority secured through compassion often outlasts authority secured through force. But Rehoboam also consulted young men who had grown up with him in the atmosphere of palace luxury. Their advice was different. Assert dominance, increase the burden, prove strength, show that the new king is not weaker than his father. Pride often sounds like strength in inexperienced ears. Rehoboam chose harshness. My father made your yoke heavy, he declared. I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. With those words, the fracture Solomon had been warned about became reality. The northern tribes responded not with negotiation, but with separation. What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. 10 tribes withdrew allegiance and crowned Jeroboam as their king. The united monarchy that had reached its golden peak under Solomon split permanently into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The tearing the Lord had spoken of was complete. It did not require foreign invasion. It did not require economic collapse. It required accumulated resentment, pride, and the fulfillment of divine judgment. Solomon's choices had set conditions. Rehoboam's pride ignited them. The kingdom David had unified through struggle and Solomon had adorned with splendor now stood divided. The temple remained in Jerusalem, but much of the nation no longer had access to it without crossing political boundaries. Jeroboam, fearing that pilgrimages to Jerusalem might restore loyalty to David's line, established alternative centers of worship in Bethel and Dan. Golden calves were erected. A familiar sin returned under a different king. Here are your gods, O Israel, he proclaimed. The irony was bitter. Solomon had permitted high places for foreign gods. Jeroboam institutionalized alternative worship entirely. What began as accommodation had matured into structural idolatry. The ripple effects of Solomon's divided heart extended far beyond his lifetime. The northern kingdom would experience a rapid succession of unstable dynasties, many marked by violence. Prophets would rise: Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, calling Israel back from persistent idolatry. Eventually, Assyria would conquer the north, scattering the tribes. Judah, the southern kingdom, would endure longer because of the Davidic line and periodic reforms under faithful kings. Yet even Judah would not remain immune to idolatry. Babylon would one day breach Jerusalem's walls, destroy the temple Solomon built, and carry the people into exile. The golden house that had once been filled with glory would lie in ruins. History does not treat compromise gently. Solomon's life stands at the hinge of Israel's national narrative. Before him, ascent; after him, decline and division. He had been given unparalleled opportunity. His wisdom surpassed all others. His wealth overshadowed every contemporary ruler. His peace extended across borders. He built the temple that symbolized God's covenant dwelling among his people. And yet the legacy he left was fractured. It is tempting to evaluate reigns by their visible achievements. If one measures by architecture, Solomon was unmatched. If by economic prosperity, unparalleled. If by intellectual contribution, extraordinary. But Scripture measures differently. It traces the line of the heart. The Lord had not been displeased by Solomon's brilliance. He had granted it. He had delighted in blessing him. The issue was never success. It was loyalty. It was affection divided between the covenant God and foreign influences. The tragedy of Solomon is not that he lacked wisdom. It is that wisdom did not guard his worship. There is a profound warning embedded in his story. Intelligence cannot substitute for obedience. Insight cannot replace devotion. Prosperity cannot secure permanence. Structures, systems, strategies, none can sustain what the heart quietly abandons. Solomon's early humility opened the floodgates of blessing. His later accommodation opened the door to division. And yet, even within judgment, the thread of promise endured. For David's sake, one tribe remained under his lineage. The covenant with David would not dissolve. Generations later, prophets would speak of a son of David whose kingdom would not be divided, whose throne would not depend on political alliances, whose wisdom would not falter. The failure of Solomon magnified the longing for a greater king, a king whose heart would remain wholly aligned, a king who would not merely build a house for God, but embody God's dwelling among his people. Solomon's reign ended in quiet burial, but its implications reverberated across centuries. The divided kingdom became the stage upon which God's faithfulness continued to unfold despite human inconsistency. When we look back at Solomon's life from beginning to end, the arc is both glorious and sobering. A young man kneeling at Gibeon, confessing inadequacy. A mature ruler dazzling nations with wisdom. An aging king permitting compromise. A divided nation bearing consequence. He began with a prayer for discernment. He ended with a proverb about fearing God. Between those bookends lies the complex story of a man who had everything the world could offer and discovered its limits. And in the quiet aftermath of his reign, as Israel and Judah stood separated, one truth echoed more clearly than ever. The stability of a kingdom is not secured by gold, nor by intellect, nor by influence. It is secured by a heart that remains wholly the Lord's. Solomon knew this once. He rediscovered it too late to prevent division, but not too late to record the lesson, and that lesson would outlive his monuments. Time has a way of clarifying what spectacle once obscured. Years after Solomon's death, when travelers looked upon the divided land Israel to the north, Judah to the south, the golden memory of his reign must have felt both glorious and heavy. The temple still stood in Jerusalem, but unity had vanished. The throne of David endured in Judah, but the nation David once ruled as one people now carried two crowns. Solomon's name remained synonymous with wisdom. His proverbs were recited, his songs remembered, his architectural achievements admired. Yet history does not preserve reputation without also preserving consequence. The split kingdom became living evidence that brilliance does not guarantee faithfulness. In the northern kingdom, Jeroboam's fear-shaped policy, afraid that the people's pilgrimage to Jerusalem would soften their loyalty, he established new centers of worship at Bethel and Dan. Golden calves stood where the ark once symbolized covenant faithfulness. The language he used echoed Israel's ancient failure in the wilderness. Here are your gods, O Israel. It was not merely political strategy. It was theological distortion. The seed of divided worship that had appeared in Solomon's later years now grew into systemic idolatry. Kings rose and fell rapidly in Israel. Assassinations, conspiracies, instability. Power shifted through violence more often than lineage. Prophets emerged as voices against corruption. Elijah stood on Mount Carmel, confronting Baal worship. Elisha continued the call to repentance. Amos thundered against social injustice. Hosea spoke of covenant love betrayed. Again and again, the north resisted correction. Judah, though retaining the temple and Davidic line, did not remain untouched by compromise. Some kings walked in faithfulness, others followed patterns of idolatry. High places reappeared. Foreign alliances were formed in moments of fear. The southern kingdom lived in tension between covenant identity and political survival. Eventually, Assyria swept down and conquered the northern kingdom. Israel was scattered among the nations. Decades later, Babylon rose against Judah. Jerusalem's walls were breached. The temple Solomon built, the masterpiece of his reign, was burned. Gold that once gleamed under the sun was stripped. Sacred vessels were carried away. The house filled once with glory became rubble. From the ashes of destruction it became unmistakably clear. Buildings cannot preserve obedience. Splendor cannot guarantee faithfulness. Even the most magnificent structure dedicated to God cannot substitute for hearts that remain wholly His. Solomon's life stood at the hinge between promise and exile. His wisdom had elevated Israel to unprecedented heights. His compromise had initiated a trajectory that would end in scattering. Though generations intervened, the fracture began with him. And yet the story does not end in ruin alone. During exile, prophets began speaking words shaped by both judgment and hope. Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant written on hearts rather than stone tablets. Ezekiel envisioned a renewed temple and a restored presence. Isaiah described a coming child who would bear the government upon his shoulders, a son given a prince of peace whose kingdom would have no end. The longing intensified. Solomon had been a son of David who built a temple and reigned in peace. But his peace was fragile. His wisdom faltered. His kingdom divided. The promises given to David seemed strained under history's weight. Could there be a king who would embody what Solomon represented without repeating his failure? The memory of Solomon sharpened the expectation of something greater, because his reign proved what even the best human king cannot accomplish alone. Intelligence cannot conquer the inclination of the heart. Prosperity cannot prevent drift. Political strategy cannot replace covenant fidelity. A divided heart inevitably produces divided outcomes. In later generations, when scribes preserved Solomon's writings, they did so not merely as cultural artifacts but as warnings. Proverbs instructed youth to guard their hearts. Ecclesiastes cautioned against chasing wind. The Song of Songs reflected beauty within covenant love. His words survived as both brilliance and Solomon's paradox endured. The wisest king who failed to guard his own heart. There is something sobering about that reality. It strips away excuses. If wisdom alone were sufficient, Solomon would have succeeded. If wealth ensured stability, his throne would have remained united. If religious architecture guaranteed faithfulness, the temple would never have burned. But history declared otherwise. Generations passed, and the divided kingdom became a memory carried in exile. The people wept by rivers far from Jerusalem. Remembering Zion, they longed for restoration, not merely political reunification, but covenant renewal. When they returned from Babylon decades later and laid foundations for a second temple, those who had seen Solomon's original structure wept aloud. The new building could not compare in outward glory. It lacked the same scale, the same gold, the same visible splendor. Yet perhaps the lesson had deepened. Glory measured in gold had proven insufficient. What the people now needed was not architectural brilliance, but transformed hearts. Solomon's story hovered over Israel's consciousness like both inspiration and caution. He had shown what divine blessing could accomplish through a humble beginning. He had also shown how easily abundance can soften vigilance. Even in the New Testament era, Solomon's name carried symbolic weight. His wisdom was acknowledged, his splendor referenced as benchmark of earthly magnificence. Yet a greater wisdom would later be proclaimed. A greater temple would be described not built with stone, but embodied in flesh. Solomon's reign, for all its tragedy, served a purpose beyond itself. It demonstrated the heights possible under divine favor. It exposed the fragility of human loyalty. It intensified longing for a king whose heart would never divide. His life becomes a mirror for every generation. We admire brilliance. We pursue success. We build structures, careers, systems, reputations, ministries. We measure stability by visible achievement. Yet Solomon's arc whispers caution. The heart remains the true center. Division begins there long before it manifests publicly. He did not wake one morning determined to abandon the Lord. He drifted gradually through accommodation, rationalization, affection. The drift felt reasonable at first. It even appeared beneficial politically. Only later did its full cost become evident. This is why his story endures, because it is not merely about ancient Israel. It is about the subtle power of divided allegiance. It is about how prosperity can mask erosion. It is about how wisdom must be continually anchored in reverence. Solomon began by confessing inadequacy. I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. That humility opened the floodgates of divine generosity. He ended by declaring that all striving without fear of God is vapor. Between those two confessions lies the entire arc of his life. His monuments faded, his kingdom fractured, but his final insight remains timeless. Fear God, keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man. The divided kingdom stands as historical evidence of the cost of neglecting that foundation. Yet the preservation of David's line even through fracture also stands as evidence of divine faithfulness beyond human failure. Solomon's name is etched into scripture not as a flawless hero, but as a profound lesson. Wisdom that is not guarded by obedience will eventually betray itself. Prosperity that is not anchored in reverence will eventually fracture. And a heart that drifts, even subtly, can shape the destiny of nations. His story is not merely history, it is warning, and it is invitation to remain undivided where he did not. As generations moved forward, Solomon's reign became more than memory, it became reference point. Parents spoke of the days when silver was as common as stones in Jerusalem. Elders recalled the dedication of the temple, when the glory of the Lord filled the house so powerfully that priests could not stand to minister. The stories carried awe, but they also carried a shadow, because everyone knew how it ended. The split between Israel and Judah did not heal. It hardened. Borders once meaningless now defined identity. Rival sanctuaries stood in tension. Different dynasties shaped different destinies. The unity forged by David and adorned by Solomon existed only in recollection. And yet, paradoxically, Solomon's writings endured as shared inheritance. Both kingdoms repeated his proverbs. Both remembered his songs. His reflections in Ecclesiastes spoke across political lines. Though the throne fractured, the wisdom literature remained whole. There is something deeply symbolic about that. His kingdom divided. His words did not. Over time, as the northern kingdom spiraled through instability and was finally overtaken by Assyria, the reality of covenant consequence became undeniable. Prophets had warned them. Idolatry had saturated leadership. Injustice had spread through society. The people who once stood at the height of prosperity under Solomon were now dispersed among foreign nations. Judah watched it happen. For a moment it seemed like a cautionary tale unfolding before their eyes. Some kings in Judah led reform. Hezekiah tore down high places and trusted the Lord against Assyria's threats. Josiah rediscovered the book of the law and renewed covenant obedience. Under these kings, echoes of earlier devotion resurfaced. But reform proved fragile. The gravitational pull toward compromise remained strong. Alliances with foreign powers replaced reliance on God. Ritual continued, but hearts drifted. Eventually Babylon rose as the dominant force of the region. Jerusalem, once the jewel of the world under Solomon, fell under siege. When Babylon breached the walls and burned the temple, it was not merely a military defeat, it was theological devastation. The very structure Solomon had built as symbol of divine dwelling was reduced to rubble. The ark disappeared from history. Sacred vessels were carried away. Gold melted. Cedar beams burned. Stones toppled. In exile, the people wrestled with a haunting question. How could this happen? The temple of the Lord had stood among them. The covenant promises had seemed secure. The memory of Solomon's golden age lingered like a dream. But exile forced clarity. The temple was never meant to replace obedience. The covenant was never meant to function without loyalty. Solomon's story, once admired for brilliance, now read as warning fulfilled. The drift that began with high places outside Jerusalem had, over centuries, culminated in complete displacement from the land. Yet exile also produced something unexpected: purification. Far from Jerusalem, stripped of monarchy and monument, the people clung more fiercely to the law. Synagogues emerged as centers of teaching. Scripture was preserved with meticulous care. The lesson carved into their collective memory was unmistakable. Survival did not depend on gold or political power. It depended on fidelity to God. When Persia eventually conquered Babylon and allowed Jewish exiles to return, a remnant journeyed back to a land scarred by history. They laid foundations for a second temple. Compared to Solomon's masterpiece, it was modest. Some elders wept, remembering former glory. Others rejoiced simply to rebuild. The second temple lacked the visible splendor of the first. No record speaks of glory filling it in the same overwhelming way. The gold was not as abundant. The kingdom was not sovereign. It existed under foreign oversight. Yet perhaps something deeper was forming. The longing for a king like Solomon, but greater intensified, a son of David who would rule with enduring righteousness. A ruler whose heart would never drift, a kingdom that would never divide. The prophets began speaking in broader horizons. Isaiah envisioned a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a remnant life emerging after apparent death. Jeremiah promised a righteous branch who would reign wisely and execute justice. Ezekiel described a shepherd who would gather scattered sheep. Micah spoke of a ruler from Bethlehem whose origins were from ancient days. Solomon's failure magnified expectation. If the wisest king could fall into compromise, then wisdom alone was insufficient. If the most prosperous reign could fracture, then prosperity alone was fragile. If the grandest temple could burn, then stone alone could not secure divine presence. Something greater was needed. Centuries passed under foreign empires, Persian, Greek, Roman. The people waited. They studied Solomon's Proverbs. They reflected on his conclusion in Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep his commandments. That line resonated more deeply after exile. It had proven true through suffering. Under Roman rule, Jerusalem still held the second temple, expanded magnificently by Herod, though not matching Solomon's original and covenant memory. Pilgrims traveled to it. Sacrifices continued. Ritual endured. Yet dissatisfaction simmered. The longing for the promised son of David intensified. Solomon's shadow lingered over that expectation. He had been a son of David who reigned in peace, whose wisdom astonished nations, whose temple symbolized God's dwelling. But his peace ended in fracture. His wisdom faltered in obedience. His temple fell to flames. The people did not need another golden age destined to crumble. They needed permanence. Solomon's narrative thus served two enduring functions. It revealed the heights of divine blessing possible under humility, and it exposed the inadequacy of human kingship to sustain covenant faithfulness across generations. Every time his name was spoken, both truths were present. He was the king who asked for wisdom instead of riches. He was the king who built the temple. He was the king whose heart turned. He was the king whose reign ended in division. In that layered legacy lies profound theological weight. God's promises to David were not nullified by Solomon's failure, but neither were they automatically secured by his brilliance. The covenant moved forward despite him, not because of his perfection. History, then, became a canvas of divine faithfulness interacting with human weakness. Solomon's life showed that even the best human ruler cannot secure ultimate stability. It must come from somewhere beyond fluctuating hearts. And so as the centuries unfolded, as empires rose and fell, as the people of Israel clung to scripture and hope, the memory of Solomon served as both inspiration and restraint. Inspiration because humility before God invites blessing. Restraint because divided affection leads to fracture. His story lingered like a carefully preserved scroll. Its words read aloud in assemblies, its lessons whispered in households. Not merely as nostalgia for lost grandeur, but as preparation for something greater than grandeur. A kingdom not built on forced labor. A temple not constructed of cedar and gold. A wisdom not vulnerable to compromise. Solomon's brilliance lit a temporary golden age. His failure exposed humanity's need for a king whose heart would remain holy, eternally aligned with God. And that longing did not fade with time. It deepened. By the time centuries had passed and empires had cycled through their seasons of dominance, Solomon's life no longer stood merely as history, it stood as testimony. His name had become layered with meaning. To speak of him was to evoke splendor, wisdom, poetry, architecture, and prosperity. But it was also to remember fracture, divided allegiance, and a kingdom that did not endure intact. The paradox remained unavoidable. He had asked for wisdom and received it beyond measure. He had been granted riches beyond comparison. He had built a temple unlike any structure the world had seen, yet he had not secured permanence. As generations read his words and proverbs, they found clarity for daily life. Guard your heart. Seek understanding, walk uprightly. As they read Ecclesiastes, they encountered sobering realism. All striving under the sun is vapor without reverence for God. As they heard the Song of Songs, they glimpsed beauty within covenant love. Solomon's voice endured longer than his throne. And perhaps that is part of the mercy woven into his story. Because monuments can be destroyed, gold can be plundered, empires can fracture, but truth spoken in repentance and clarity can outlive ruins. The final note of his reflections, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, rings like distilled wisdom forged through both glory and regret. It is not theoretical theology. It is lived experience condensed into a single foundation. Fear God, not merely admire him, not merely build for him, not merely speak of him. Fear him, revere him, remain loyal to him. Solomon's life demonstrates that proximity to sacred things does not guarantee loyalty. He stood in the temple he built. He prayed at its dedication. He watched fire fall from heaven. Yet later he tolerated altars to other gods. The human heart is capable of astonishing contradiction. That is why his story matters so deeply. He was not an ignorant pagan king stumbling in darkness. He was the wisest ruler of his age. He knew the law. He had direct encounters with divine revelation. He experienced blessings unparalleled in Israel's history, and still he drifted. If such a man could drift, then no one is immune to subtle erosion. But if such a man could also articulate hard-won clarity at the end of his life, then no one is beyond the reach of reflection. Solomon's narrative invites readers into uncomfortable honesty. It dismantles the illusion that success secures safety. It exposes the fragility of external achievement when internal devotion weakens. It forces confrontation with the truth that divided hearts produce divided outcomes. And yet, it also preserves hope, because even through Solomon's failure, God's covenant purposes continued moving forward. The promise to David did not collapse when Solomon compromised. It endured through division, exile, and restoration. The line continued. The expectation deepened. Solomon had built a house for God's name, but history revealed that the ultimate fulfillment of God's dwelling among his people would require something greater than cedar and gold. He had reigned in peace for a time, but lasting peace would not come through political alliances or administrative genius. He had displayed wisdom that astonished nations, but a wisdom untouched by compromise remained necessary. His life, therefore, becomes both culmination and contrast. Culmination because it represents the apex of Israel's earthly monarchy, contrast because it reveals the limits of that monarchy. In Solomon we see how high human leadership can rise under divine blessing. In Solomon we also see how vulnerable it remains when devotion fragments. That tension shapes the entire biblical narrative moving forward. Every subsequent king is measured, in part, against David's heart and Solomon's wisdom. Some reform, some rebel, most falter in varying degrees. The nation learns repeatedly that no human throne guarantees covenant faithfulness. When later generations reflected on their history, Solomon stood as a turning point. Before him, ascent toward unified strength. After him, a long winding road through division, exile, and longing. Yet his writings remain startlingly relevant beyond their era. The human questions he wrestled with, meaning, pleasure, wealth, injustice, mortality, are not ancient curiosities. They are enduring realities. What profit is there in toil? What satisfies the soul? What remains when wealth fades? What anchors life when death approaches? Solomon did not answer these with denial. He faced them directly. He explored them honestly. He tested them personally, and his conclusion returned not to complexity, but to simplicity. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is not the resignation of defeat. It is the clarity of perspective. In the end, the grand narrative of his life reduces to a lesson both profound and accessible. The heart must remain undivided. All the gold of Ophir cannot compensate for divided worship. All the cedar of Lebanon cannot secure lasting obedience. All the proverbs of wisdom cannot substitute for reverent allegiance. Solomon's reign shimmered like a sunrise over Jerusalem, brilliant, expansive, full of promise. But by evening, shadows lengthened. The light did not vanish completely, but it was no longer unified. And so his story closes not in triumphant conquest nor dramatic collapse, but in sober instruction. He began as a young king, aware of his inadequacy. He rose to heights no other king matched. He drifted through compromise masked by success. He reflected in age with piercing honesty, and he left behind words that outlived his empire. The temple he built fell. The kingdom he expanded divided. The wealth he accumulated dispersed. But the wisdom he distilled remains. In that enduring voice lies both warning and invitation. Warning that even the greatest gifts can become liabilities if the heart grows careless. Invitation that reverent obedience, though less dazzling than gold, anchors a life more securely than monuments ever could. Solomon's life does not end with despair. It ends with clarity. And clarity, when embraced, becomes grace. His crown has long since crumbled to dust, but his final insight still stands steady, unadorned, unshakable. Fear God, keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man.